Hello everyone, my name is Zach Molter and I will be doing a review of the Zachman framework for enterprise architectures. This presentation is for the University of Michigan in Flint for CIS 562. So the Zachman framework was originally created by John A. Zachman in 1987. It is a framework that is designed to organize and analyze data for enterprise architectures. It is a classification system or scheme based in a 6x6 matrix format. The Zachman framework is both useful and significant to the management of the organization as well as the actors involved in the development of enterprise systems. John Zachman was working with IBM in the 1980s developing business system planning resources, but by 1982 he had concluded that these analyses could reach far beyond the automating systems design that they were being used for. He believed that they could help in the areas of strategic business planning. In 1987, John Zachman developed the Framework for Information Systems Architecture that would later become known as the Zachman Framework. The Information Systems Architecture did not define in detail what the models should contain. It did not enforce the modeling language used for each model. It also did not propose a method for creating these models. You will see an example of the 1987 framework on the next slide. By 1992, Zachman and his co-author John Sowa had modified and updated the Zachman framework to contain several changes, most notably the scope perspective of the planner. You will see these modifications in the next slide after that. And finally, the current Zachman framework was developed in 2008. I will be covering it in much more detail in an upcoming slide. This is the Zachman framework in 1987 before it was actually called the Zachman framework. According to the creators, the information systems architecture was designed to be a classification schema for organizing architecture models. Here you can see the evolution of the framework from 1987 to 1992. The most obvious change is the addition of the scope perspective of the planner. Zachman and his co-author John Sowa also added the detailed representative perspective. This allowed the who, why, and when columns to be brought into the public view of the framework. This closely resembles the current Zachman framework that is still used today. And this is the Zachman framework as it is used today. And now I will go over the methodology behind it. So the basic concept of the Zachman framework is that complex processes or items can be described in different ways to be useful for different purposes. The Zachman framework provides 36 different categories to be able to completely describe everything, in particular complicated and complex items such as manufactured goods, capital, enterprises, people, and technologies. The 36 different categories are found by using 6 different transformations of an abstract idea from 6 differing perspectives. Each row of the Zachman framework represents a particular perspective's total view of the solution. The restraints of the higher rows affect the lower rows. However, the lower rows do not necessarily affect the rows above it. Each column is essentially an easy way to focus the attention on the same fundamental questions and then answer those questions from that row's viewpoint. So I'm going to explain the rows now. Row 1 is the executive perspective row or scope contexts and is the preliminary SketchUp of the architecture. This depicts the size, shape, partial relationships, and basic purpose of the final structure in gross terms. It corresponds to an executive summary for an investor or a planner who needs an overview of the scope of the system, including how it would relate to the general operating environment as well as the cost. Row 2 is the business management perspective row. This is the business concepts or architect's drawings, which depict the final objective from an owner's perspective. This corresponds to the enterprise business models, which constitute the business's design and entities, as well as the processes and how they relate. Row 3 is the architect perspective, also known as system logic. This is the translation of the drawings into detailed requirements from the designer's perspective. This is designed by a systems analyst who must determine the functions, logical process flow, and data elements that correspond with the system model. Row 4 is the engineer perspective row, or technology physics. The contractor must then redraw the architect's plans to represent the builder's perspective. This must include enough detail to understand the technology, materials, and constraints of the tools needed. The engineer's plans must adapt to the information systems model to details that include output, input, programming languages, devices, or any other required supported technology. Row 5 is the technician perspective, or tool components. The plans then must be partitioned for the subcontractors to have specific details needed for specific technicians. These detailed subsections correspond to specifications that are given to programmers that code individual modules or technicians that build part of a system, without being concerned with the overall context or structure of the entire system. And finally, row 6 is the enterprise perspective, or operations instances. This is a view of the functional systems being deployed in its operational environment. Like I said before, each column is essentially an easy way to focus attention on that same fundamental question, and then answer that question from that row's viewpoint. This creates different descriptive representations or models which translate from a higher to lower perspective. The basic model of each column is defined down the matrix. Column 1 is inventory sets, which pertains to the question what. Column 2 is process flows, pertaining to the question how. Column 3 is distribution networks, pertaining to the question where. Column 4 is responsibility assignments, which pertains to the question who. Column 5 is timing cycles, pertaining to the question when. And finally, column 6 is motivation cycles, which pertains to the question why. Because of the layout of the rows and columns in this matrix, as well as the columns each answering a specific question, the Zachman framework is unique in that each element on either axis of the matrix is unique and distinguishable from all the other elements on that axis. There are 3 other main enterprise architectures, but they do vary quite a bit from the Zachman framework. The 3 frameworks are the Open Group Architecture Framework, the Federal Enterprise Architecture, and Gartner's Enterprise Architecture Process and Framework. The Zachman framework is mainly a scheme of the needs required from different viewpoints for an entire enterprise system. However, the main goal of the Open Group Architecture Framework is to create an industry standard on how to develop architectures. On the other hand, the Federal Enterprise Architecture can be viewed as either a methodology for creating an enterprise architecture or an implemented enterprise architecture. It was created by a council of chief information officers from different governmental bodies. And finally, Gartner's is best described as a practice in that it is ongoing and focused on experience, training, and the ongoing connections for the organization. I have found that while the Zachman framework is widely used and accepted, there are still 3 main criticisms of the framework. A common criticism of the Zachman framework is its generalized layout. Critics state that the value of the model is lessened when the generalization increases, because a one-size-fits-all model for building something as complex as an integrated enterprise system is probably not something that can be easily generalized. A second criticism is that there is very little hard data that actually supports the use of the Zachman framework, as organizations have both failed and succeeded because of and in spite of the Zachman framework. After 30 years, there should be more data that supports the framework's usage. This doesn't mean that it is not useful, it just means that there is not much data to support it. And finally, the last criticism is a big one to me. The framework is focused on building an enterprise system from the ground up and not utilizing any infrastructure that an organization may already have in place. This is a very black and white view of it and can make the framework either very expensive or not viable at all for a lot of organizations. In conclusion, while the Zachman framework does come with some criticisms, it is still a solid foundation to begin implementing an enterprise system in a large company or organization. It will give the organization all the different perspectives needed for all the actors to be able to achieve the integration of the system. The ability to apply the Zachman framework to nearly any organization's needs is why it has remained so popular for over 30 years. I have quite a few references, so these next few slides will show them all. And more, and some more references, and the end of the references. And thank you so much for listening. Have a great day.